Hey friends, it's Jimmy here, just kindly asking you to click like and subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment saying where you're listening from. This really helps my videos go out to a wider audience, especially when you leave a quick comment. Now, with that said, let's break down some historical mysteries that scholars really debate. Imagine you're a Roman soldier in 214 BC, part of one of the mightiest forces the world has ever known, sailing to conquer the wealthy Sicilian city of Syracuse. Your commander, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, is a celebrated general, and this should be a straightforward siege. But as your ship approaches the city's seawalls, the world turns into a nightmare. Without warning, a monstrous iron claw erupts from the fortifications, grabs the prow of the ship next to yours, and hoists it into the air as if it were a toy. The vessel is shaken violently, spilling soldiers into the sea before being smashed against the cliffs. From the walls, an unseen enemy unleashes a perfectly calibrated storm of projectiles. There are immense stones that crush ships from afar, and swarms of smaller darts that sweep the decks as you get closer. The Roman soldiers, terrified by an enemy they can't see, begin to believe they aren't fighting men at all. Marcellus himself, in a moment of despair, reportedly called his foe a geometrical Briareus, a mythical hundred-handed giant who used Roman ships like cups to ladle water from the sea. The source of this terror was a single 75-year-old man, Archimedes. He was a mathematician and engineer of such profound genius that he single-handedly held the Roman army and navy at bay. His documented machines were so effective that they cemented his reputation as a figure of almost supernatural power. Yet, among all the tales of his fearsome arsenal, one weapon stands apart. A story so spectacular it has captivated and confounded historians, scientists, and engineers for millennia. This is the shocking claim that Archimedes also wielded the sun itself, using an array of mirrors to create a heat ray that could incinerate the Roman fleet from a distance. Before we can dissect the reality or mythology of the heat ray, it's essential to understand the terrifying truth of Archimedes' confirmed inventions. Numerous ancient historians provide remarkably consistent and detailed accounts of these machines, none more feared than the claw of Archimedes. Often called the Iron Hand, this device was a massive crane-like lever, likely concealed behind the battlements. As a Roman quinquereme drew near the walls, the beam would swing out over the water. A heavy iron grappling hook, suspended by a chain, would be dropped onto the ship's bow. Then, through a system of ropes and what Livy describes as a massive counterweight, the machine would violently jerk the front of the ship upwards. This would lift it vertically out of the water, and the results were often catastrophic. Some ships were capsized instantly, while others were repeatedly dashed against the rocky cliffs until they splintered, all while the crew was thrown overboard. Early modern historians actually dismiss this invention of Archimedes as a likely fiction, simply because even thousands of years later, this couldn't be replicated. However, modern reconstructions have repeatedly confirmed the mechanical plausibility of the claw, lending significant weight to the accuracy of these ancient accounts. Archimedes' genius wasn't limited to this single spectacular weapon. He orchestrated the city's entire defense with a mathematician's precision, creating an arsenal designed to engage the Romans at every possible range. While the fleet was still far out at sea, it was harassed by powerful, long-range catapults and ballistae that launched immense stones, some reportedly weighing as much as 200 pounds. As the surviving vessels drew closer, a second tier of smaller, more rapid-fire machines took over, ensuring the barrage was relentless. For the final approach, when Roman marines thought they were safe under the shadow of the walls, Archimedes had another surprise. He had pierced the fortifications with a series of small loopholes through which defenders could fire missiles from small anti-personnel artillery pieces. This layered, systematic approach to defense is the true mark of his brilliance. He didn't just invent a series of weapons, he engineered a comprehensive solution that anticipated every move the Romans made. It was this systematic genius that made him seem invincible and created the fertile ground from which an even greater legend could grow. The idea of the heat ray is simple and elegant. It proposes that Archimedes used a collection of mirrors, perhaps the polished bronze shields of his soldiers, to act as a parabolic reflector. By coordinating these mirrors, the defenders could focus the sun's electromagnetic energy onto a single spot on a Roman ship. This would raise the wood's temperature to its auto-ignition point of around 300 degrees Celsius, setting it ablaze. It's a concept rooted in basic physics, the same principle that allows a magnifying glass to light a piece of paper. But when we turn from physics to history, the foundation for this story begins to crumble. The most powerful argument against the heat ray is the profound silence of the sources who should have known best. The Greek historian Polybius, writing just a few decades after the siege, provides the most detailed and reliable account of Archimedes' defenses. He likely interviewed survivors and meticulously documented the usage of the iron claw and the various catapults. Yet, in his exhaustive narrative, there isn't a single word about burning mirrors or any weapon involving harnessing the power of the sun. For a historian so focused on the specifics of technology, omitting what would have been the most spectacular weapon of all time is an almost definitive refutation. The silence is echoed by the Roman historian Livy and the Greek biographer Plutarch, both of whom wrote detailed accounts of the siege centuries later. Yet another instance of deafening silence comes from Archimedes' own contemporary, the geometer Diocles. Diocles wrote a treatise specifically titled On Burning Mirrors, in which he explored the focal properties of parabolic reflectors. He mentions Archimedes in his work, but never in connection with using such a device as a weapon at Syracuse. The historical record reveals a clear pattern of legendary embellishment over time when it comes to Archimedes. The first faint whispers connecting Archimedes to fire don't appear until the 2nd century, nearly 400 years after the siege. The writers Lucian and Galen both mention in passing that Archimedes destroyed ships with fire, but their accounts are vague, lack detail, and never mention mirrors. The first explicit, unequivocal mention of burning glasses as Archimedes' weapon comes from Anthemius of Tralles around 500, a full 700 years after the event. Crucially, Anthemius presents his description of how the device might have worked as his own speculation, not as established fact. His account was, in essence, a theoretical description of how Archimedes, one of the greatest engineers and mathematicians of all time, could have plausibly done it. He wasn't explicitly making the claim that Archimedes had actually invented a heat ray, but merely observing that he could have done so. The most vivid and detailed accounts, the ones that often form the basis of the modern legend, come from writers in the early part of the last millennium. They were working with Anthemius's hypothetical and transformed it from a plausible scenario into a definite fact. This chronological progression is a classic hallmark of myth-making. The story grows more elaborate and fantastic the further it gets from the actual event. While the historical evidence is thin, the question of scientific feasibility has kept the legend alive. Over the years, numerous experiments have tried to answer that question, yielding somewhat positive, though ultimately mixed results. The case for plausibility rests largely on two key experiments, and they do show that under absolutely ideal conditions that the system could work. In 1973, Greek engineer Ioannis Sakis assembled 70 sailors, each holding a large mirror, and successfully set a tar-coated plywood rowboat on fire from a distance of about 160 feet. Then, in 2005, a team of students at MIT conducted a now famous experiment using 127 one-foot square mirrors. They focused the sunlight onto a mock-up of a Roman ship made of red oak, and after about 10 minutes of sustained, uninterrupted sunlight, achieved flash ignition. These tests proved that, under the right conditions, the physics of the heat ray are sound. However, skeptics have pointed out problems. For instance, the reported successes depended on controlled stationary conditions. Yet a ship at sea constantly bobs and sways, so it's virtually impossible to keep a focused hotspot on one patch of wood for the 10+ minutes needed to ignite it. The weapon also requires perfect, uninterrupted sunlight and specific orientation, so a passing cloud or the wrong time of day would instantly render it useless. Finally, coordinating hundreds of mirror bearers to aim precisely at a small, moving target while standing exposed to enemy archers is a logistical and tactical nightmare. Skeptics have pointed out that far simpler incendiaries like flaming arrows or pots of pitch would be much more reliable. When the historical silence is weighed together with the scientific impracticality, the verdict becomes clear. The Archimedes heat ray, as a superweapon that laid waste to the Roman navy, is almost certainly a myth. The most reliable ancient historians, those who marveled at his other machines, never mention it. And modern science, while confirming the basic physics, has shown it to be a deeply flawed and unreliable weapon for the chaotic reality of ancient battle. But personally, I think the main argument against it is far simpler. Archimedes was too brilliant an engineer to have deployed a costly device so dependent on perfect weather, a stationary target, and flawless coordination. For Syracuse, this was a civilizational threat from the Romans, and dedicating such resources to a device that could so easily fail seems unlikely. He had already designed a nearly perfect weapons system to counter the siege by the far superior Roman forces. Ultimately, the reason the story still carries so much weight is because Archimedes was a genius beyond comprehension. After all, if there was anyone who could invent a solar weapon in the 3rd century BC, it would have been Archimedes. But perhaps the most interesting thing of all is that ultimately he may have invented the heat ray, but simply never deployed it. Unfortunately, most of Archimedes' works are lost to time, and there may still yet be a source that does prove that he invented the heat ray. Also, I'm thinking about doing a series on Archimedes' most wild inventions, so let me know in the comments below if that's something you'd like to watch. Hey everyone, Jimmy here, just jumping in with another reminder to hit the notification bell and share this video. Also, don't forget that you can support my work for as little as $1 a month through the YouTube membership by clicking that join button. He was Alfred the Great, the bastion of Christian Wessex, the king who held the line against the pagan Vikings of the great heathen army. His piety was legendary, his commitment to the church absolute. Yet, if you were to open the official history commissioned during his reign, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the very first page would present you with a stunning paradox. Before the annals of battles and laws, you'd find a genealogy, a family tree tracing Alfred's own royal line and that of all West Saxon kings, directly back to a pagan god, Woden. This wasn't an oversight or a forgotten relic. It was a declaration that these Germanic kings were of the blood of the god more widely known now as Odin. The central puzzle of the early English kingdoms is why a new Christian society would actively promote a lineage rooted in the very paganism they fought to supplant. The answer reveals that this was no contradiction, as it might initially be seen, but a masterful act of political statecraft. The continued claim of descent from Woden by Christian Anglo-Saxon kings was a sophisticated strategy. Through a clever intellectual framework, these rulers and their clerical allies transformed a pagan deity into a human ancestor. This preserved a vital source of traditional legitimacy while integrating their Germanic heritage into a new, universal Christian worldview. In the pre-Christian world of the Germanic peoples, kingship wasn't an abstract concept bestowed by some higher authority. A king's right to rule rested on a potent and visible triad of qualifications that everyone could readily understand. These were overwhelming success in battle, a reputation for generosity demonstrated by the lavish distribution of gifts to his followers, and, most critically, an impeccable ancestry. The king was more than a hardened commander. He was a judge at assemblies and a high priest at sacrifices, the essential link between his people and the divine. This connection was often understood as being quite literal, with royal families claiming direct descent from a god. For the continental Germanic peoples, various gods were preferred amongst various different tribes and groups. For the Anglo-Saxons who settled in Britain, the preeminent divine ancestor was Woden. Known to the Norse as Odin, he was a complex and powerful deity associated with wisdom, magic, strategic conflict, and crucially, royalty and kingship. The evidence from early England is stark. To wield significant power, one had to be Woden-born. This was the ideological bedrock of the right to rule. The earliest written genealogies, compiled in a text known as the Anglian Collection, show the royal houses of all the kingdoms claimed direct descendants from this god. Before these lists were ever committed to parchment by monastic scribes, they were a vibrant part of a rich oral tradition. They were maintained and performed by court poets, whose chanted recitations in the great halls served as a public and constant affirmation of the king's sacred lineage. This insistence on Woden descent effectively created a closed, hereditary elite, restricting the pool of potential rulers to a handful of families who could claim this status. While victory in conflict was necessary, it wasn't sufficient without having a decent claim to this divine lineage. Any successful commander could win a battle, but only a descendant of Woden possessed the inherent, sacred charisma to command the lasting allegiance of a kingdom. This system provided a measure of stability, preventing an endless cycle of challenges for the throne. But it also created the central crisis that Christianization would later provoke. When an entire system of legitimacy depends on descent from a pagan god, it collapses the moment the entity is reclassified as a devil. Beginning in the late 6th century with the arrival of Augustine's mission in Kent, the gradual Christianization of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms presented a profound ideological challenge. The conversion was largely a top-down affair, with missionaries targeting kings and nobles first. The motivations were often political, offering rulers access to the administrative technology of literacy, the cultural prestige of Rome, and powerful new alliances. However, the new faith brought with it a fiercely monotheistic cosmology that was fundamentally incompatible with the old ways. Christian writers like the Venerable Bede didn't frame the old gods as lesser or different deities. They were explicitly labeled as demons and their worship as idolatry. This theological shift was a direct assault on the foundations of royal power. A king whose primary claim to rule was his descent from Woden, a figure now deemed a cunning deceiver by the Church, faced a catastrophic crisis of legitimacy. In fact, some thought that Woden wasn't just a run-of-the-mill demon, but the very literal Prince of Darkness himself. The transition was neither swift nor smooth. The historical record reveals a long period of religious fluidity. For instance, one king of East Anglia famously maintained a temple with altars dedicated to both Christ and the Germanic gods. Many kingdoms that adopted Christianity under one ruler quickly reverted to paganism upon his death. For centuries after the official conversion, the church and state found it necessary to pass laws forbidding pagan practices, which clearly continued underground, even in noble circles. This messy reality is key to understanding the king's dilemma. To completely repudiate their Woden-born status would have been to reject their people's history and the very source of their family's inherited authority. In a society where power was personal and built on tradition, such a move would have been politically disastrous. The problem for the kings wasn't whether to keep the Woden connection, but how to keep it in a way that was compatible with their new Christian identity. The solution to this seemingly intractable problem came from an ancient intellectual tool known as euhemerism. Named for the Greek philosopher Euhemerus, this theory proposed that the gods of mythology weren't divine beings at all, but were originally great human kings and heroes. Their deeds were so remarkable that later generations had mistakenly elevated them to the status of gods. Notably, Euhemerus was himself born in the 4th century BC, which was seen as elevating this argument. It was an acknowledgement that even pre-Christian people had significant doubts about the reality of their various pantheons. Anglo-Saxon Christian intellectuals ended up adopting this euhemeristic strategy wholesale. They didn't deny Woden's existence, they simply reclassified him. He was stripped of his divinity and recast as a great, ancient, and entirely mortal king who had lived long ago on the continent. The historian Ethelward, a royal descendant himself, later wrote explicitly that Woden was merely an ancestral Germanic chieftain, whom pagans had wrongly elevated to godhood. This recategorization was the perfect compromise. It allowed a Christian king to retain his prestigious lineage and his unbroken connection to the legendary founder of his dynasty. Further, the implication of this reclassification had an obvious undertone to it. The person who was a king had been descended from someone who exhibited such unworldly power that the only rational explanation the people had was godhood. Anglo-Saxon monarchs were just as happy with this as being descended from literal gods, because in essence, it acknowledged their ancestors were equal in power to gods. Of course, the deep philosophical understanding from Euhemerus was that the legend built over centuries. However, I doubt that this was a distinction that the average medieval Anglo-Saxon of any social class aside from the clergy would actually make in practice. This strategy was put into practice in the royal genealogies, most notably preserved in the Anglian collection and the various manuscripts of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. They were actively compiled, edited, and expanded under direct royal patronage. A key part of the project was standardization. For example, the kings of Essex originally traced their lineage to both Woden and a different god. In later Christian-era genealogies, this other god was cleverly made a son of the now human Woden, for reasons that will become apparent shortly. The final and most audacious step in this project was to extend the pedigrees beyond Woden. The scribes constructed a new, deeper history, connecting the great ancestral king through a series of legendary figures all the way back to the biblical patriarch Noah. From there, they built on to pre-existing genealogies to prove how their kings were the direct descendants of Adam himself. While this may seem unimpressive in a world where everyone was believed to be a descendant of Adam, to have actual proof of it was a great boost to prestige. The earliest surviving manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for instance, traces Woden's ancestry back to a figure named Scaife, who's identified as a son of Noah born on the Ark. This act subsumed the entire Germanic origin story within the universal history of the Christian Church. Woden was no longer the starting point of the royal line. He was merely a distant descendant of a biblical patriarch. The persistence of Woden in the family trees of devout Christian kings was a brilliant and necessary act of political and cultural engineering. It was a pragmatic response to the crisis of legitimacy brought on by Christianization, made possible by the elegant intellectual tool of euhemerism. This carefully crafted lineage wasn't a contradiction to be explained away, but the very cornerstone of a new form of royal power. It allowed Anglo-Saxon kings to construct a powerful and uniquely hybrid identity. They projected an authority rooted in both the martial glory of their Germanic ancestors and the divine sanction of the Christian God. This whale tale begins not in the dim light of a dockside tavern, filled with the tall tales of sailors, but in the respected halls of 17th century science. Its protagonist is Sir Robert Sibbald, a man whose credentials lent immediate and formidable weight to his claims. He was a physician, a founder of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, and the first and founding professor of medicine at the University of Edinburgh. He had been appointed Geographer Royal for Scotland, and he was a foundational figure in the Scottish Enlightenment. He was, by the standards of his day, a meticulous observer of the natural world, so much so that he is often regarded as the father of cetology, the study of whales and dolphins. It's this reputation that makes his 1687 account of a strange creature washed ashore so compelling and persistent. In his work Phalainologia Nova, a pioneering text on the whales of Scotland, Sibbald described a female whale that had stranded on the island of Orkney. It was, he reported, a type of sperm whale, but with one astonishing defining feature: an enormous dorsal fin. To convey its scale, he reached for a familiar maritime analogy, describing the fin as being similar to the mizzenmast of a ship. This single evocative phrase is the bedrock of the entire legend. A mizzenmast is the third and shortest mast on a large sailing ship. Yet even so, the comparison suggests a structure of almost unbelievable proportions. Depending on the vessel, such a mast could stand anywhere from 20 to 80 feet tall, implying a fin that would dwarf any known anatomical feature in the animal kingdom. Beyond Sibbald's foundational account, the evidentiary trail for the high-finned whale grows cold with astonishing speed. For a creature with such a dramatic appearance, its appearances in the historical record are remarkably few and far between. The entire case rests on just two primary events, separated by more than 250 years, each plagued by its own significant flaws. The first, Sibbald's 1687 observation, remains the most credible simply due to the reputation of the observer. However, despite being the first person to study whales and dolphins in a true academic sense, it's still a single anecdotal account from over 3 centuries ago. No physical evidence was preserved for future scientific scrutiny. Further, the description of the fin, as noted, was based on a poetic but imprecise metaphor, leaving its true size and shape to the imagination. Sibbald could have simply been using hyperbole to describe the size of the fin, since he very clearly didn't actually say that the fin was the equivalent in height to a mizzenmast. The second major sighting, and the only significant one of the modern era, occurred in September 1946. An unusual creature was reportedly seen trapped for 2 days in the Annapolis Basin of Nova Scotia in Canada. If Sibbald's account was ambiguous, this one was a case study in scientifically useless data. Local observers provided estimates of the animal's length that were wildly inconsistent, ranging from as little as 10 feet to as much as 100 feet. This tenfold variance suggests that no one got a clear, measurable look at the creature. The estimates for the all-important dorsal fin were equally vague and biologically absurd, also ranging between 10 and 100 feet. Despite the animal being confined to a basin for a full 48 hours, no photographs or sketches were taken of the creature. Further, this was a fishing town with whalers. If the whalers in the town truly believed they were seeing a wondrous animal, well, I suspect they may have bagged it and tagged it. The evidentiary basis for this whale is, therefore, extraordinarily fragile. It consists of one unverified report and one modern report so riddled with inconsistencies as to be meaningless. In the decades since 1946, an era of widespread photography, advanced whale-watching tourism, and sophisticated scientific surveys, there have been no new, credible sightings. The 1946 event also highlights a fundamental challenge in observing marine life: the immense difficulty of accurately judging scale and distance on the open water. With no landmarks for reference, a smaller object seen up close can easily be mistaken for a much larger object farther away. It's a perceptual trap that can easily give rise to monsters, and the hopelessly broad estimates from the Annapolis Basin suggest that the observers had fallen squarely into it. With the direct evidence for the whale proving to be so flimsy, the investigation must turn to alternative explanations. The most compelling and widely accepted scientific theory posits that the legend is not about an unknown animal, but rather a misinterpretation of a very well-known one. Orcas have the highest dorsal fins of any whale or dolphin, and dorsal fins of over 6 feet are routinely observed. Add in issues with frames of reference on open water, and this provides one explanation why this legend may have flourished. A thorough investigation requires the consideration of all possibilities, even those that are remote. While the orca misidentification theory stands as the most robust explanation, it's worth exploring whether a genuine biological anomaly could account for the sightings. One possibility is that the creature was a whale with a rare genetic mutation. It's conceivable that a mutation could cause abnormal growth of the dorsal hump or the fin, creating a larger structure. While genetic mutations are a constant in nature, the scale of the required change is problematic, since it would require an extremely substantial change. To put it in context, this would be like a human having legs that are 7 feet long. It's not outside the realm of imagination, but from evidence and observation, it's just something we know doesn't happen. However, there is a related concept called atavism, which is the reappearance of a lost ancestral trait. In rare instances, modern whales have been born with small vestigial hind limbs, a throwback to their land-dwelling ancestors. The primary flaw in this theory is the lack of any fossil evidence to suggest that the ancestors of whales ever possessed such a giant dorsal structure. Atavism can only reawaken a genetic blueprint that once existed. It can't create one from scratch. That said, the fossil record is of course extremely incomplete, so it's always possible there is actually a whale ancestor out there with a high fin that science hasn't yet discovered. Others believe that the high-finned variant of the common whale we have today may have been a very rare species which was hunted to extinction. As you'll recall, the earliest sighting was in the late 17th century, which was the very dawn of modern animal science. Believers in this theory propose that Sibbald's whale may have been the last of a creature that has never been fully documented by science. Since you can't prove a negative, this really just remains a fascinating idea at this point. Putting this theory aside, perhaps the most conclusive piece of evidence against the existence of the creature comes not from what was seen, but from what was never seen. This is the argument from silence, and its source is one of the most extensive, detailed, and brutal records of human interaction with the natural world. These are the logbooks of the global whaling industry. From the 18th century through the late 20th century, commercial whaling was a massive industrial enterprise Fleets from America, Europe, and later Asia hunted whales across every ocean on the planet, from the equator to the polar ice. Whaling vessels were floating factories and data collection centers. By law and custom, the ship's mate was required to keep a detailed daily logbook. These logs recorded the ship's position, weather conditions, and, most importantly, every whale sighted, chased, struck, and captured. They noted the species, the size and the yield of whale oil, and every dimension of the whale itself. Despite this, not a single high-finned whale of any species was found at any point. Ultimately, the story of this high-finned creature is likely more valuable as a lesson in the process of science than as an unsolved zoological and scientific mystery. However, the legend's persistence speaks to our enduring fascination with the mysteries of the deep ocean and what creatures might be secretly lurking beneath the waves. Personally, against all the odds, I want to believe that a small population of these majestic high-finned whales roam the seas.